In the unforgiving heart of the 1878 Wyoming Territory, a lone woman's world was measured in rifle cartridges and inches of snowfall. She was a ghost on the frontier, a widow with nothing left to lose until the day a child's scream shattered the silence of the pines. What happened next was an act of raw courage against one of nature's most terrifying forces. But the true story began after the fight. It's a story of suspicion, a trial of survival, and a decision that would rewrite the laws of the frontier, uniting two worlds against a common enemy. The wind that swept down from the Bighorn Mountains had a voice. Most days it was a lonesome whisper through the lodgepole pines that crowded Abigail Parsons's small homestead. On others, it was a mournful howl that rattled the single glass pane of her cabin window, a constant reminder of her profound isolation. It was the autumn of 1878, and the silence in the valley was a heavy blanket, stitched with the memory of the husband she had buried 2 years prior. Caleb had been a man of grand dreams, his eyes full of the golden promise of the West. He'd seen this small, defensible valley, with its clear-running creek and meadows, shielded by rocky bluffs as their Eden. He'd felled the trees himself, notching the logs with a strength that seemed as boundless as the sky. But the frontier took as much as it gave. A timber accident, a crushing finality that had left Abigail with only the cabin Caleb's rifle and the echo of his laughter in the unforgiving wind. She was not a fragile woman. The West had burned that away, leaving behind someone lean and resilient, with hands as capable of kneading dough as they were of skinning a buck. Her face, framed by plain brown hair, often tied back with a leather thong, was a map of quiet sorrows and fierce determination. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, missed nothing. They saw the subtle shift in a deer's ear at 100 yards, the telltale sign of a coming blizzard in the cloud patterns and the creeping dread of another winter alone. Her nearest neighbor was a hard day's ride east, a crotchety old fur trapper named Silas, who communicated mostly in grunts. Beyond him, the settlement of Buffalo was a distant rumor, a place she hadn't seen since she and Caleb first passed through. Her world was this valley. Her companions were the steady thud of her axe, the crackle of her hearth, and the heavy presence of Caleb's Winchester Model 1873, which leaned ever ready by the door. Lately, however, a new feeling had settled over the valley. It wasn't the familiar loneliness or the watchfulness of a mountain lion. It was the unnerving sensation of being observed by human eyes. Twice she'd found a single unfamiliar moccasin print near the creek, deliberately placed where she would find it. It wasn't a hunter's careless track. It felt like a message, a silent declaration of presence. She knew the stories. Bands of Lakota sometimes swept through. Displaced tribes pushed ever westward by the relentless tide of settlement roamed these lands, their desperation making them unpredictable. The whispers in Buffalo had spoken of the Cherokee, a people driven from their ancestral homes in the southeast, with some splintered bands pushed as far as this remote wilderness, their pride wounded and their trust in her kind non-existent. Abigail doubled her vigilance. She took to carrying the Winchester not just on her hunting trips, but even when she went to the creek for water. She reinforced the heavy bar on her cabin door and slept with a Colt pistol tucked beneath her pillow of straw and burlap. She wasn't afraid, not in the trembling, helpless way of the women she'd known back in Ohio. Her fear was a cold, sharp thing, a tool. It honed her senses, quickened her step, and kept her finger light on the trigger. One crisp afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple, She was checking her snare lines in the thicket north of her cabin. The air was still unnaturally so. The usual chatter of squirrels had ceased, and the birds were silent. Abigail froze her hand, resting on the smooth-worn stock of the Winchester. She sank into a crouch behind a screen of aspens, her eyes scanning the woods. That's when she heard it. It wasn't the wind. It was a sound that turned her blood to ice, the high, terrified scream of a child. It was followed by a sound from the deepest pits of primordial terror, the guttural, earth-shaking roar of a grizzly bear. Every instinct screamed at her to retreat, to bolt for the safety of her cabin and bar the door. That was the survivor's choice. But the child's cry came again, closer this time, laced with a pain and panic that cut through her own fear. In that single desperate sound, Abigail heard the echo of everything she had lost, the future she and Caleb had planned the children they would never have. The cold tool of her fear was suddenly forged into something else entirely. It became a hot, righteous fury. A child, was about to be extinguished by the same brutal indifference of the wilderness that had taken her husband. Without a second thought, she broke from the cover of the aspens and ran toward the sound, the heavy Winchester feeling as light as a feather in her hands. The laws of survival were about to be broken. The story of the silent widow in the lonely valley was about to end, and a new, far more dangerous one was about to begin. The forest floor, a carpet of pine needles and damp earth, muffled her footsteps as she moved. The roaring was louder now, a continuous rumbling threat that seemed to vibrate through the soles of her worn leather boots. Through a break in the trees, she saw the scene a tableau of primal horror. A massive grizzly, a mountain of muscle and matted brown fur, stood on its hind legs, its form silhouetted against the failing light. It was enormous, larger than any bear she'd ever seen. Its head swaying from side to side, long yellowed teeth bared in a terrifying snarl. Pinned against the unyielding rock face of a small canyon wall was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 9 or 10 years old, with straight black hair and skin the color of burnished copper. He wore buckskin leggings and a simple tunic, and in his small hand he clutched a knife that looked like a toy against the beast's sheer scale. His face was a mask of terror, but his eyes, weird and dark, still held a spark of defiance. He was Cherokee, the moccasin prince, the feeling of being watched. It all clicked into place with sickening clarity. The bear dropped to all fours with a ground-shaking thud and swiped a paw at the boy. The claws, each as long as a man's finger, tore through the air with a wicked whistle. The boy, agile and desperate, scrambled sideways, the claws missing his face by inches, but catching his shoulder, ripping through the buckskin and flesh beneath. He cried out a sharp gasp of pain and stumbled. That was the moment Abigail arrived at the edge of the clearing. There was no time for a plan. No time for a clean shot from a distance. There was only the bear, the boy, and the certainty of death. "Hey!" she screamed, her voice raw and loud. "Here! Over here!" The grizzly's massive head snapped around. Its small black eyes, full of ancient, malevolent intelligence, fixed on her. It let out another roar, this one a direct challenge, a warning to the new intruder. For a terrifying second, it remained focused on her, giving the boy a precious moment to scramble away from the rock wall, clutching his bleeding shoulder. Abigail raised the Winchester, the stock fitting snugly against her own shoulder. She had one advantage: Caleb had taught her to shoot, not just at stationary targets, but with the calm precision of a true hunter. "Don't aim for the head, Abby," his voice echoed in her memory. "Too much bone. Aim for the heart and lungs, the boiler room." The bear charged. It wasn't a run. It was an avalanche of fury. The ground trembled. Trees that seemed mighty and strong shook as the beast brushed past them. Abigail stood her ground, her world narrowing to the brass bead of her front sight and the charging mass of fur and teeth. She let it come, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. 20 yards. 15. Crack. The first shot was true. It struck the bear high in the chest, just to the side of its thick neck, the 44-40. Slug packed a punch, and the grizzly staggered, a grunt of pain and surprise erupting from its lungs. But it didn't stop. A wounded grizzly was exponentially more dangerous. It was enraged now, its charge renewed with a terrifying, vengeful speed. 10 yards. Abigail worked the lever action, the practiced motion smooth and swift. Shuck-chick. A fresh round slid into the chamber. Crack. The second shot hit lower, closer to the center of its massive chest. The bear stumbled again, its front leg buckling for a moment. Blood now matted the fur on its chest, dark and slick. It was hurt badly, but its momentum was unstoppable. It was a locomotive of pure rage. 5 yards. She could smell its foul, wet fur and carrion breath. She could see the feral light in its eyes. She worked the lever again, but in the chaos, her sweaty hand fumbled the motion for a split second. The moment was lost. There was no time for another shot. The bear rose up, towering over her, its shadow swallowing her whole. A paw wide as a dinner plate, with claws like scythes, swung down. Abigail didn't scream. She reacted. Dropping the rifle, she threw herself sideways, landing hard on the rocky ground. Pain shot through her ribs, but she was clear. The bear's claws tore through the air where her head had been gouging deep furrows in the earth. As it landed off balance from its missed swipe, she saw her opening. Scrambling on her hands and knees, she grabbed the hunting knife from the sheath on her belt. Caleb's old, heavy-bladed knife. The bear was turning, roaring its jaws, snapping just feet from her. She didn't have the strength to pierce its thick hide or skull. But Caleb had taught her something else, a desperate last resort for a cornered hunter. As the bear lunged, she didn't try to stab it. She drove herself forward under its snapping jaws and thrust the knife blade up with all her weight and desperation, deep into the soft, unprotected flesh of its throat, just behind the jawbone. Hot coppery blood gushed over her hand and arm. The bear let out a choked, gurgling roar of shock and agony. It thrashed its head wildly, trying to dislodge her, and a back-swinging claw caught her side, its talons slicing through her buckskin jacket and the flesh beneath like razors. White-hot fire seared her ribs, but she held on grimly, pushing the knife deeper. The beast's struggles grew weaker. It staggered back, a grotesque fountain of blood pumping from the mortal wound. It took 2 more lurching steps. Then its legs gave out, and it collapsed with a final shuddering sigh that shook the very ground. Silence descended upon the clearing, thick and absolute. Abigail lay on the ground, gasping for air, her side screaming in agony. The world swam in a haze of pain and adrenaline. Slowly she pushed herself up her arm, and jacket soaked in the bear's blood. Her own blood seeping warmly from the deep gashes in her side. Her eyes found the boy. He was staring not at the dead grizzly, but at her. His face was no longer defiant or terrified. It was filled with a profound, stunned awe. He looked at the blood-soaked white woman, at the mountain of dead fury beside her, and then back at her. He took a hesitant step toward her, then another. He looked at her wound, then at his own. He knew. He had been saved from certain death by an act of impossible courage. And it was in this moment of shared silence, surrounded by the carnage, that the first fragile thread of a bond was woven. A bond forged in blood and terror. A bond that would soon be tested in ways neither of them could possibly imagine. The first 5 days of Abigail Parsons's new life had just begun. The silence that followed the Grizzly's fall was heavy with the metallic scent of blood and the damp smell of the forest floor. For a long moment, Abigail and the boy, Tyan, simply stared at each other across the 20 feet of space that separated them, the massive still form of the bear, a grotesque monument between them. The adrenaline that had fueled Abigail's impossible charge began to ebb, replaced by a throbbing, searing pain in her side. She pressed a hand against the wound, and it came away slick with her own blood. Tyan, his eyes wide, with a mixture of fear and wonder, took a halting step towards her. He clutched his own savaged shoulder, his gaze flickering from her face to the wound in her side, then back again. The language barrier was a chasm between them, but the universal language of pain and survival was crystal clear. Abigail offered a small, pained smile, trying to convey that she wasn't a threat. It's all right," she murmured the words lost in the vast quiet. She pushed herself to her feet, a wave of dizziness washing over her. She needed to get back to the cabin to clean and stitch her wound before infection set in. The wilderness was as likely to kill you with a festering cut as it was with a bear's claws. She retrieved her Winchester, its familiar weight a small comfort, and turned to the boy. Using simple gestures, she pointed to his shoulder, then to herself, then in the direction of her homestead. "Come with me. I can help." The boy hesitated, his ingrained distrust of a white person, warring with the undeniable fact that she had just saved his life. Before he could decide, the forest itself seemed to come alive. There was no sound of approach, no snapping twigs or rustling leaves. One moment they were alone, the next the clearing was ringed by them. 10, maybe 12 silent figures materializing from the shadows of the pines like spirits. They were Cherokee warriors, their faces grim, their eyes hard as flint. They were dressed for the hunt, armed with bows and rifles, their bodies lean and powerful. Their collective gaze fell upon the scene. The dead Grizzly, the injured boy of their tribe, and the white woman covered in blood, holding a rifle. To their eyes, it was not a rescue. It was an enigma, a potentially hostile one. One warrior, taller than the rest, with a stern, weathered face marked by a single scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, stepped forward. His eyes, dark and piercing, held an ancient authority. This was Chief Kalanu, the boy's father. His gaze swept over his son, a flicker of relief quickly masked by a stone-faced composure. Then his eyes locked onto Abigail's. There was no gratitude in them, only a deep, penetrating scrutiny. Another warrior, younger and with a fear in his eyes that bordered on outright hostility, moved to the chief's side. His name was Onakona, or White Owl, known for his prowess as a scout and his unyielding hatred for the encroaching settlers. He pointed a finger at Abigail. "She has him," Onakona said in the Cherokee tongue, his voice sharp and accusatory. He assumed, as any of them might, that she was somehow responsible for the boy's predicament, perhaps a trapper whose snares had endangered him. Tyon, seeing the hostility in Onokona's face, found his voice. "No," he cried out also in Cherokee. "She saved me." "The bear. She killed the bear." He pointed a trembling finger at the dead beast, then at Abigail. Kalanu held up a hand, silencing them both. He walked slowly into the center of the clearing, his movements deliberate and regal. He knelt beside the massive bear, examining the fatal wound in its throat, then the 2 rifle shots in its chest. His experienced hunter's eye read the story in the tracks, the blood and the gouges in the earth. He saw where the boy had been cornered, where the woman had stood her ground, where she had fallen, and where she had made her final desperate attack. It was a story of unbelievable bravery. He rose and walked over to Abigail, stopping just a few feet from her. The height difference was significant. He towered over her, a figure of imposing authority. He said nothing, simply looking at her, his gaze weighing her, judging her. He saw the blood soaking her side, the grit in her eyes, the exhaustion etched on her face. He spoke, his voice a low rumble, not in Cherokee but in halting, heavily accented English. "You are hurt." Abigail was taken aback. She nodded, her throat too dry to speak. Kalanu gestured to his son. "You save him." It was not a question, but a statement of fact. He had read the evidence. The bear was going to kill him. Abigail managed to say, her voice hoarse. Onokona stepped forward again, speaking in English now for her benefit, his voice dripping with suspicion. Why does a white woman help a Cherokee boy?" "Your kind only takes from us. You take our land, our game. You bring sickness." Before Abigail could answer, Kalanu turned his head slightly and spoke a sharp command in their own language. Onokona fell silent, his jaw tight with resentment. Kalanu's attention returned to Abigail. He saw the paleness spreading across her face as the blood loss took its toll. Her strength was failing. "You cannot stay here," he stated. "You will die." He made a decision, his face unreadable. "You will come with us." It was not an invitation. It was a command. 2 warriors stepped forward. One gently took the Winchester from her unresisting hands. The other moved to support her as her knees began to buckle. The world was tilting the edges of her vision, going dark. As she was half led, half carried away from the clearing, her last conscious sight was of Chief Kalanu, lifting his son into his arms, his stern face for a moment softening with a father's love. She had saved the boy, but she had not earned her freedom. She was now a captive being taken to the heart of a people who had every reason to hate her, her fate resting entirely in the hands of the stern chief, whose judgment was as sharp and unforgiving as the Wyoming winter. The next 5 days would not be a period of recovery, but a trial. Abigail drifted in and out of consciousness, her world a confusing blur of swaying movement, hushed voices speaking a language she didn't understand, and the persistent throbbing fire in her side. She had a vague impression of being carried on a makeshift travois, the scent of pine and horse sweat filling her senses. When she finally opened her eyes to a lucid world, she was no longer in the forest. She lay on a soft bed of buffalo and deer hides inside a tipi. The air was warm and smelled of wood smoke, herbs, and tanned leather. A small, controlled fire glowed in a central pit, its smoke rising lazily toward the opening at the peak of the conical structure. The late afternoon light filtering through the stretched hide walls cast a soft amber glow on her surroundings. Her wound had been treated, The torn fabric of her shirt and jacket had been cut away, and the deep gashes were covered with a poultice of mashed green leaves held in place by a clean linen bandage. Surprisingly, it looked like it had been torn from a settler's shirt. The pain was still there, a dull, heavy ache, but the sharp, searing agony was gone. A woman sat silently by the fire, grinding herbs with a stone pestle and mortar. She was older, her face a beautiful web of wrinkles, her long grey hair tied in 2 neat braids. She looked up as Abigail stirred her dark eyes, holding a calm, non-judgmental wisdom. She was the one who had tended to her. Where am I?" Abigail whispered, her voice raspy. The old woman, whose name was Noya, did not speak English, but she understood the question in the tone. She simply offered Abigail a wooden bowl filled with a warm, bitter-tasting broth. Abigail, weak with hunger and blood loss, drank it gratefully. It seemed to chase some of the chill from her bones. For the next 2 days, this was her world. The teepee, the quiet presence of Noya, and the muffled sounds of the village outside. She learned that she was in a small, hidden encampment nestled in a high mountain valley, a place deliberately chosen to be invisible to the outside world. This was the temporary home of Kalanu's band, a splinter group of Cherokee who had traveled a long and bitter road from their ancestral lands. Her status was ambiguous. She was not a prisoner in chains, but she was not free. Warriors stood a discreet distance from her teepee day and night. She was a patient, but also an object of intense curiosity and suspicion. Children would sometimes peek through the flap of her teepee, their eyes wide before being shooed away by their mothers. The whispers followed her everywhere. On the 3rd day, she felt strong enough to walk. With Noya's help, she stepped outside the teepee for the first time. The village was larger than she'd expected, a collection of some 30 teepees arranged in a wide circle. Women were tanning hides, men were fletching arrows, and the air hummed with the quiet industry of a people fighting to maintain their way of life in a hostile land. Her appearance caused an immediate stir. All activity ceased. All eyes turned to her. She saw a spectrum of emotions on their faces: curiosity, fear, resentment, and in a few, a flicker of something that looked like respect. She saw the boy Tyan playing a game with some other children. His shoulder was bandaged, but he moved with the boundless energy of youth. He saw her and stopped the other children falling silent behind him. He looked at her, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement of their shared ordeal. It was a tiny gesture, but it felt monumental. Onakona, the hostile warrior, was there too. He stood with a group of other young men, his arms crossed, his face a mask of contempt. He made no secret of his belief that she was a disease, a harbinger of the ruin that followed all white settlement. Her act of bravery in his eyes was a trick, a fluke, or worse, a calculated deception to gain their trust before betraying them. "The White Witch lives," he said, loud enough for her to hear, speaking in English to ensure the insult landed. "Does she seek to trade her magic for our lands?" Abigail ignored him, her gaze steady, her expression neutral. Showing fear or anger would only confirm his prejudice. She had learned long ago that silence could be a far greater weapon than words. Her real test came later that day. Chief Kalanu summoned her to his teepee, the largest in the village, decorated with painted symbols of ravens and mountains. He sat on a pile of buffalo robes, his face as severe and unreadable as ever. Tyan sat beside him, watching her with solemn eyes. "You are stronger," Kalanu stated. "Thanks to your people's care," Abigail replied, her voice steady. "Noya is a great healer. She says the bear's claws were poisoned by rot. Without her herbs, the fever would have taken you." He paused, letting the weight of his statement settle. "You saved my son. I have given you your life in return. The debt is paid." Abigail's heart sank. She had hoped for something more, for safe passage, for understanding. "What happens now?" she asked. "That is what our council will decide," Kalanu said. "Onokona and his followers believe you are a scout for the army or for land thieves. They say you should be killed before you can bring others to our sanctuary." "And you?" Abigail dared to ask, looking him straight in the eye. "What do you believe?" Kalanu's gaze was unflinching. "I believe what I see. I saw you fight a grizzly for a boy you did not know. This is not the act of a coward or a deceiver. But the heart of a white person is a mystery. We have learned this through much sorrow." He gestured to the world outside the teepee. "We are all that is left of a proud branch of our people. We have survived the long walk sickness and the white man's bullets. My duty is to them, not to you. My son's life is precious, but the survival of our people is everything." His words laid the stakes bare. Her life was a political calculation. Gratitude was a luxury he could not afford. As if on cue, a scout burst into the teepee, his face grim. He spoke rapidly to Kalanu in Cherokee, his words urgent. Abigail couldn't understand the language, but she saw the change in the chief's demeanor. His face darkened, the lines around his eyes deepening. Kalanu looked at Abigail, a new cold light in his eyes. "My scout reports riders near the eastern pass," he said in English. "White men, heavily armed. They fly the brand of Jedediah Kane." The name sent a chill down Abigail's spine. Kane was a name whispered with fear, even in Buffalo. A ruthless cattle baron who believed in manifest destiny, with a rifle buying up land and taking what he couldn't buy. He was known to have a posse of hard men on his payroll, gunslingers and thugs who enforced his will. They were the very reason she and Caleb had sought out such an isolated valley to be free of men like him. "One of them," Kalanu continued, his voice dangerously low, "found tracks leading from your cabin. Tracks of a woman being carried, surrounded by unshod ponies. They are following us." Suddenly, everything shifted. She was no longer just a suspicious outsider. In the eyes of Onokona and many others, she was now the source of a direct and imminent threat. She was the breadcrumb trail that had led the wolf to their hidden door. Her trial had just become infinitely more deadly. The news of Kane's men spread through the village like a contagion of fear. The quiet industry of the camp was replaced by a tense, nervous energy. Warriors began checking their rifles. Mothers pulled their children closer, and every face that looked at Abigail was now etched with accusation. She was the lightning rod for their collective anxiety. Onokona seized the moment. He stood in the center of the village, his voice ringing out a fiery sermon of condemnation. "I warned you," he declared, pointing a shaking finger toward Abigail's tipi. "She is a plague. She brings the vultures to our last sanctuary." Jedediah Kane does not ride for sport. He rides for land, for water, for whatever his greedy eyes see. She has led him here. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Men who had been neutral now looked at her with hardened eyes. Women who had felt a flicker of sympathy now clutched protective amulets. Abigail remained inside her teepee, hearing it all. Noya sat with her, her face grim, but she did not leave. The old woman's quiet solidarity was a small anchor in a sea of hostility. Abigail's mind raced. Kane. Of all the threats in this unforgiving land, he was one of the most ruthless. His ambition was a cancer on the territory. She knew his reputation. He considered homesteaders like her to be squatters and native tribes to be vermin, both to be cleared from the land he coveted. Kalanu did not address the crowd. He called a council of his senior warriors and elders, sequestering them inside his own teepee. Their angry debating voices could be heard for hours. Abigail knew her fate was being decided within those hide walls. Meanwhile, Kalanu had sent his best scouts, silent as ghosts, to shadow Cain's party. They returned after nightfall with disturbing news. It wasn't just a scouting party. It was a group of 12 men, led by Cain's infamous foreman, a brutal man named Finn. They weren't just following the tracks. They were mapping the area, taking note of water sources and grazing meadows, and they had found her cabin. The scouts reported that Finn's men had ransacked it, tearing it apart in search of valuables before setting it ablaze. The home she and Caleb had built, the last physical remnant of her old life, was now a pile of smoldering ash. The news struck Abigail with the force of a physical blow. The finality of it was crushing. She had nothing left in the world now but the clothes on her back and the life she was fighting to keep. But the scouts brought back one more piece of information, a detail that would change everything. While looting her cabin, one of Cain's men had found her husband's journal, which she had kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard. The scout, who had learned to read some English at a mission school years ago, had crept close enough to hear them laughing as they read passages from it. They mocked Caleb's dreams of a peaceful life, but they were particularly interested in his detailed entries about the valley, the defensible positions, the location of the best spring, the game trails. And then the final damning piece. One of Cain's men had said, "The chief was right. The Cherokee band the army drove off last spring must have come through here. This valley's perfect. Once we clear out this squatter's nest and any redskins hiding in the hills, this whole territory is ours for the taking." When Kalanu was told this, he understood. Cain hadn't been led here by Abigail. He had been coming here all along. His scouts had likely been watching this region for months. Abigail and the Cherokee band were two separate problems, occupying the same prize. Her presence and the subsequent abduction was merely a convenient pretext, a perfect excuse to move in with force and claim he was rescuing a citizen or avenging her death. Kalanu emerged from his teepee. The entire village was gathered, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of the central fire. Onakona stood before them, still fanning the flames of their fear. "We must give her to them," Onakona was shouting. "It is our only chance, a sacrifice to appease the beast." "Silence!" Kalanu's voice boomed across the encampment, cutting through Onakona's tirade. The authority in his tone was absolute. He walked to the center of the circle, his scouts behind him. He looked at the anxious faces of his people, the people he had led through so much hardship. "Onakona speaks with the passion of a warrior." Kalanu began, his voice calm but powerful. But his eyes are clouded by old hatreds. He sees the spark but mistakes the source of the fire. He recounted what the scouts had seen and heard. He told them about Cain's men, mapping their land before they found Abigail's trail. He told them of the plan to exterminate any red skins they found hiding in the hills. He held up a scorched piece of leather, all the scout could retrieve from her burned cabin. "This woman," he said, turning his gaze toward Abigail, who had emerged from her teepee to listen, "is not the cause of our trouble. She is like us in the path of the storm. Jedediah Cain does not want one woman's homestead. He wants this valley. He wants our water, our game, the very ground beneath our feet. And once he has it, he will want the next valley and the one after that. Giving him this woman would not sate his hunger. It would only be an appetizer. The crowd was silent, their anger and fear now mingled with a dawning terrible understanding. The true enemy was not the lone woman who had bled for one of their children. The true enemy was the shadow that had been looming over them all along, a shadow of greed with a name Jedediah Cain. Kalanu walked over to Abigail. He stopped before her, the eyes of his entire tribe on them. The 5 days were nearly over. Judgment was at hand. "The debt between us is paid in blood," he said, his voice softer now for her alone. "But the world has created a new debt, a debt of survival. Your enemy is now our enemy. Your fight is now our fight." He looked back at his people. "Onokona sees a white woman an enemy. I see a warrior who faced a grizzly with nothing but a knife to save one of our own. I see a survivor whose home has been turned to ash by the same man who would see us starved or driven into the winter snows. Her courage is a weapon we will need. Her knowledge of her own people's ways may be a shield." He turned back to Abigail, his face set. "The council has decided. You are not our prisoner, and you are not our sacrifice." He paused, the anticipation in the air so thick it was hard to breathe. "We ask you to be our ally." The chief's words hung in the cold night air, stunning the assembled tribe into a profound silence. Ally. The word was a seismic shock, rearranging the entire landscape of their assumptions. Onokona stared, his mouth agape, his fiery rhetoric extinguished by the cold water of his chief's logic. Tyann, standing near his father, looked at Abigail with undisguised pride, as if her vindication was his own. Abigail felt a dizzying mix of relief and disbelief. She had been prepared for a death sentence, or banishment at best. An alliance was something she could never have conceived. She looked at Kalanu, at the hard-earned wisdom in his eyes, and saw not a sentimental fool, but a brilliant pragmatist. He was a leader making the only move on the board that offered a chance at victory. "An ally," Onokona finally sputtered, finding his voice. "We would ally ourselves with a snake, because it bites our enemy. She is not one of us. Her people are the reason we are here in this cold, forgotten land. Her people, Onokona, are not one solid tribe." Kalanu countered, his voice patient but firm. "They are as fractured as any other. There are the Cain men who see the land only as something to be conquered and stripped bare. And there are the homesteaders like her who wish only to plant their roots and live. The wolf does not distinguish between the lone sheep and the shepherd. To Cain, we are all just obstacles." He turned his attention back to Abigail. The entire village watched, waiting for her response. This was no longer just Kalanu's decision. It was a pact that required 2 willing parties. "We do not ask you to become Cherokee," he clarified, his voice resonating with sincerity. "We ask you to stand with us, as we will stand with you. Your rifle is true. Your courage is proven. You know the mind of men like Cain, in a way we do not. We have knowledge of this land of moving without a sound of fighting in the shadows. Alone we may both be broken. Together we may survive." This was the pledge. It was not born of sentiment or a magical, instantaneous friendship. It was a hard, practical thing, forged in the crucible of mutual desperation. It was an acknowledgement that their shared enemy was a greater force than their historical division. Abigail looked around at the faces in the firelight. She saw the women who had looked at her with suspicion, now watching with cautious hope. She saw the warriors, their animosity replaced by a grudging respect. She looked at Noaya, who gave her a slow, encouraging nod, and she looked at Tyan, the boy whose life had become inextricably linked with her own. Her cabin was gone. Her husband was gone. Her old life was a ghost. These people, in their own way, had also lost everything. They were survivors just like her. Here in this hidden valley was a chance not just to survive, but to fight back, to stand for something. She straightened her shoulders. The pain in her side, a dull reminder of the fight that started it all. She met Kalanu's gaze, her own eyes clear and resolved. "I have nothing left to go back to," she said, her voice clear and carrying across the silent camp. "The man who burned my home is the same man who wants to destroy yours. My fight is already your fight. I accept your offer. I will be your ally." A sigh of collective relief and resolve went through the crowd. This was a moment of profound significance, the weaving together of two disparate threads of humanity against a common threat. Kalanu nodded a grave smile, touching his lips for the first time. "Then it is done," he declared. He turned to his people and spoke in the rolling musical tones of their native tongue. Abigail couldn't understand the words, but she felt their power. He was explaining the new reality, cementing the alliance, not just as a military strategy, but as a sacred duty. He finished by speaking a phrase that seemed to hold special weight. The assembled tribe members repeated it after him, their voices a unified chorus that seemed to rise up and push back the darkness. Later, as a new sense of purpose settled over the village, Tyan approached her. "What did your father say?" Abigail asked him gently. "The last words." Tyan looked up at her, his young face serious. "He told them we are now tis la gelis di," he said, pronouncing the Cherokee words with reverence. "What does that mean?" "It means," Tyan explained, "we who are bound together as one people like family. It is a pledge of loyalty. It means your enemies are buried in our ground and our enemies fall to your rifle. It means we share the same fire, the same food, the same future. Bound together as one people, the weight and the beauty of it settled over Abigail. 5 days ago, she had been a widow alone and waiting for the winter to close in. Now she had a purpose, a future, and impossibly a family. She had saved a Cherokee boy from a grizzly bear, and in doing so had found a tribe. The loyalty wasn't a gift given out of simple gratitude. It was a pact sealed in the face of annihilation, a promise to face the coming storm, not as strangers, but as one. The alliance was not given time to age like fine wine. It was thrown immediately into the fire. Jedediah Kane was not a patient man. His foreman Finn, emboldened by the easy destruction of Abigail's cabin, and convinced he was dealing with a scattered, frightened remnant of a tribe, decided to press his advantage. The plan was simple and brutal, a swift, overwhelming assault on the encampment to eradicate the Indian problem once and for all. But Kalanu's scouts were his eyes and ears, and they saw Finn's party of 12 men arming for an attack, preparing to ride into the valley at dawn. There was no time to run, no time to hide. The stand had to be made here and now. A council of war was held around the central fire, but this time Abigail was not on the outside. She stood beside Kalanu, a participant. Onakona was there, his hostility now redirected toward the true enemy, his eyes burning with a warrior's focused intensity. "They will come up the main pass," Onakona stated, drawing a map in the dirt. "It is the only way for a dozen riders to approach with any speed. We can meet them there, warrior to warrior." That's what they'll expect, Abigail said, her voice quiet but firm. All eyes turned to her. They think you're savages who will charge out and be cut down by their repeating rifles. They're arrogant, cocky. They'll ride in bunched up, making easy targets. She looked at Kalanu. But they won't be expecting a ghost on the ridge. A plan began to form, one that blended Cherokee tactics with a frontiersman's cunning. It was a strategy born of their new alliance. They would not meet Finn's charge head-on. Instead, they would use the terrain, the element of surprise, and their unique combination of skills. The hours before dawn were a hive of silent, purposeful activity. 6 of Kalanu's best warriors, including Onakona, armed with bows and arrows, melted into the forest on the left side of the narrow pass. Their job was not to kill, but to create chaos by taking out the horses. Another 4 warriors, armed with rifles, took up positions behind a rock fall on the right side, a perfect ambush point. Abigail's role was different. Kalanu guided her up a steep, hidden trail to a high ledge overlooking the entire pass. It was a difficult climb, especially with her healing wound, but the position was perfect. It was over 300 yards from the trail, below, far beyond the effective range of the pistols and carbines Kane's men would be carrying. But it was not beyond the range of Caleb's Winchester. From here she could act as a sniper, providing covering fire and picking off targets who escaped the initial ambush. She was their eye in the sky, their long-range thunder. As the first hints of grey light touched the eastern peaks, Abigail lay prone on the cold rock, the Winchester resting on a small pile of stones for stability. Below the valley was a sea of mist. She could see the Cherokee warriors moving into their final positions, so silent and fluid they barely seemed real. She felt a strange sense of belonging, a feeling that had been absent since Caleb's death. She was no longer a lone woman against the wilderness. She was a piece of a larger whole, a vital part of a living, breathing defense. Soon she heard them, the clink of horseshoes on rock, the low murmur of voices, a coarse laugh. Finn's posse was riding into the trap. They came, as she predicted, clustered together, rifles holstered, confident they were on a simple extermination mission. She sighted on the lead rider, Finn himself, a big bearded man with a cruel face. She let her breath out slowly, just as Caleb had taught her. She didn't fire. The signal was Kalanu's. It came as a perfectly imitated hawk's cry from the trees below. Instantly, the quiet pass erupted into lethal chaos. A volley of arrows whispered from the woods, silent but deadly. 3 horses went down, screaming and flailing, throwing their riders to the ground. The posse, caught completely by surprise, descended into confusion. Men yelled, drawing their weapons, unsure where the attack was coming from. Then the 4 rifles from the rock fall opened up their shots, echoing like cannon fire in the narrow canyon. 2 of Kane's men were knocked from their saddles before they even knew what was happening. Finn, experienced and vicious, rallied his remaining men. "It's the trees to the left, fire! Into the trees!" he bellowed, dismounting and taking cover behind his fallen horse. This was Abigail's moment. The battle below was a confusing scrum of shouting men and panicked horses, but from her perch she saw it all with perfect clarity. Finn was organizing a defense, trying to establish a firing line. He was the brain of their operation. She centered the Winchester's sights on his chest, accounted for the distance, and gently squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. Far below, a fraction of a second later, Finn was thrown backward as if hit by a sledgehammer. The shot was perfect. Chaos turned to outright panic. Her next shot took down a gunslinger who was trying to scramble for better cover. The bullet kicked up dust right at his feet, making him flinch, and her second, more carefully aimed shot found its mark. Her position was so unexpected, so far away, that the men below couldn't even tell where the deadly fire was coming from. They thought it was ricochets, or just impossibly lucky shots from the ambushes below. With their leader gone, and 2 more of their number down from an unseen rifle, the remaining riders broke. All thoughts of fighting vanished, replaced by a desperate instinct to flee. They turned their horses and galloped madly back down the pass, pursued by the triumphant shouts of Kalanu's warriors. The battle had lasted less than 5 minutes. When Abigail made her way back down to the valley floor, the Cherokee were emerging from the woods. They looked at her with a new level of reverence. Onakona, his face smudged with dirt, and his eyes bright with the thrill of victory, approached her. He stopped and simply looked at her rifle, then at her. "The shot on Finn," he said, his English still clipped, but his tone stripped of its earlier contempt. It was the shot of a true warrior. He gave her a sharp, respectful nod and walked away. It was the highest praise he was capable of giving. Kalanu came to her side, his face grimly satisfied. "Today we showed the wolf our teeth," he said. "This is not the end. Cain will send more men. But today, the Tasvla Gelis D drew first blood. Together." Abigail looked at the rising sun, illuminating the valley, at the brave people who had accepted her as one of their own. Her home was ash. Her past was buried, but for the first time in 2 years, she wasn't looking back. She was looking forward to the next fight, the next sunrise, a future she would face not alone, but with her tribe. The story of Abigail Parsons and Kalanu's Cherokee band is a testament to the fact that family isn't always the one you're born into. In the crucible of the American West, survival often meant forging alliances in the most unlikely of places. Theirs was a bond sealed not by words, but by shared courage, mutual respect, and the shadow of a common enemy. It's a powerful reminder that the lines drawn between people can be erased by the simple, profound act of seeing the humanity in one another, especially when facing a storm. Their battle against Jedediah Cain was just beginning, but they would face it together, a tribe of 2 worlds united by a pledge of loyalty more sacred than any law written on paper. If this story of courage, survival, and the unlikely bonds forged on the frontier resonated with you, please show your support. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a powerful historical drama, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more tales from the untamed heart of the past. Click the notification bell so you won't miss our next story. Thank you for listening.